Hello, my name is John Braidwood, and I am here celebrating the 130th birthday, if you will, of the Parsons College here in Fairfield, Iowa. And I am a resident of Traverse City, Michigan, the uppermost part of the lower peninsula of Michigan, if you will. And I'm here to have a discussion with my dear friend, Dr. Robert Tree, regarding the history of Parsons College and the Parsons College Foundation.
And I'm Robert Tree. I was faculty member at Parsons College for 18 years and have continued to make my home here in Fairfield ever since. And I'm very happy to join John, one of our graduates, in this conversation about the Parsons College Foundation and the Civic Center, which we're all very interested in seeing it come to completion. So John, it's good to join you here this morning.
It
for
is,
this afternoon, I guess
well,
it really
indeed,
is now.
and it's quite my pleasure.
Yes, good. What do you have in mind?
Well, I thought it might be interesting if you might discuss a little bit about the conception of Parsons College and what you might know in terms of the history of its founders and the early years of the institution having been in progress.
Well, now you realize, John, that I am programmed for the 50-minute hour, something like that, but I will try to keep it at less than 50 minutes. The college was founded in 1875 by General Lewis B. Parsons, Jr., and his younger brother Charles, and two or three others associated with them, to put into effect the provisions of the will of the Parsons brothers' father, Lewis Baldwin Parsons, a merchant, farmer, landowner from upstate New York, who had traveled out here in the Iowa Territory long before Iowa became a state in 1846, and had been very impressed with the land and what it probably could grow and so forth. And so he had invested in something like 3,000 acres of land in central Iowa, and then in his will had provided that this would be the foundation of a college that he would like to have established in this region. He did not specify a town or anything like that. He left that to his executors. Mr. Parsons died in 1855, and for the next several years, of course, the country was in great turmoil in the problems leading up to the Civil War, then the Civil War itself. That was not concluded until 1865. Then there were all the problems of the Reconstruction era, and so it wasn't until the 1870s that his executors, his eldest son, who had played a key role in the supplying of men and equipment to General Grant in his campaign of the Mississippi, and to the other executors, were now free to put into effect the Parsons Senior's will. And in 1874 and 5, they visited a number of communities around the state who were interested in getting this bequest. Here in Fairfield, the committee met with a group of townspeople, and one of the things, according to Willis B. Parsons, a later president of Parsons College and a descendant of the Parsons family, one of the things that impressed the General Parsons and Charles was that this was the only meeting that opened with prayer. And being devout Presbyterians, as their father had been, this very much impressed them. And this also is the reason why Parsons College became connected with the Presbyterian Church from the beginning, although that was not a provision in the Parsons' will. But he was a Presbyterian, the boys, the sons were, and so it just seemed like a natural thing to do. And so the town raised something like $25,000 in the next several months to go along with the Parsons bequest. And the land was purchased at the north edge of town and included the hen mansion. It was Bernard Hen property that was acquired, and the hen mansion became the original building on the campus. And originally it housed the president and his wife and family in part of the building, and the rest of the building was used for classrooms. And I believe there was even a bit of a dormitory space there originally. Well, the hen mansion became Ewing Hall during most of the Parsons College history, and is now gone back to being the hen mansion. I might also add, as does the author of A Fair Field, Susan Welty, that the students in the early days referred rather irreverently to that house as the hen house. And so the students had a way of being irreverent and cavalier then, as they have ever since. So that's kind of in a nutshell, the background of the founding of the college.
Well, Bob, I have been so impressed with what is I think a wonderful story regarding General Lewis Baldwin Parsons as a military officer for the Union Army. It turns out that he might very well have been one of many, or if you will, one of the best kept secrets of the success of the Union Army. He had responsibility of his first battle with specifically Vicksburg, where he was asked to commandeer 100 plus boats to be sailed down the Mississippi River, if you will. And if you can envision, Vicksburg was really protected by a very deep gorge as the Mississippi River made its way through. And Grant was having a real problem getting to the Confederates because they were so well protected on this gorge. So his idea was to bring down as many boats as possible, armed with men, with the idea of, as I have read anyway, with the idea of using up the Confederate ammunition and supplies so that the siege could progress, and hopefully at some point Grant would be able to starve them out into position. And it's interesting also to note that this particular battle was the beginning, if you will, of Ulysses S. Grant as Commander-in-Chief of the Union Army. And up until that point, the Union Army had had some terrible, terrible defeats, and Abraham Lincoln, was beside himself. He was looking for a general that could win and make something happen, so he decided on Grant, and here was Grant's opportunity to prove it to him. And here's General Parsons working in his behalf with the responsibility of the logistics of setting up the battle, and he did it with such precision and within the timing that Grant was looking for, that Parsons became very well known all of a sudden for what was some very unusual abilities, and that of course was staging battles. He also had responsibility for, and maybe you can help me with this, Dr. Tree, a succession of battles for Grant that were also equally successful. And I think you probably have seen the same letters that I have, copies of letters from Abraham Lincoln and General Sheridan and, General Sheridan, Ulysses S. Grant, and was it Stanwick?
Yeah, Secretary of War Stanton. Named Stanton.
Secretary of War Stanton, all lauding the brilliance and performance of this General Lewis Baldwin Parsons. And doesn't it become quite, well, I want to use the word amazing, that more people are now familiar with his contribution to the Union Army and the success of the Union Army in the Civil War?
Well, I think there's a very good reason for that, actually, John. The layman and the historian tends to look at the tactics and the strategy. And so it is the Grants, the Shermans, the Napoleons, They're the ones that get written up.
Yes, good
The
point.
military people themselves, however, look at the logistics. How do you get the supplies, the ammunition, the guns, and so forth from point A to point B where they are needed?
Indeed.
And that's where your unsung heroes come in. And it will be their work that will often be studied in greater detail at West Point than perhaps the campaigns of Sherman and Sheridan and the rest, because it is what really counts is that your winning general has what he needs to win with at the right time.
If I can interrupt you for just a second, and emphasizes exactly what you're saying, Doctor, and that simply is that this past weekend at the reunion, I had parents of a West Point graduate who came up to me and said the following: my son spent 3 days, 3 days of classes studying General Lewis Baldwin Parsons and what he contributed to the Civil War and what he contributed to the success of a battle. So I think that's very solid reinforcement.
Well, I think so too, and that is really the case. What Grant did, and I certainly am not putting him down at all, but what Grant did at Vicksburg is spectacular. It's front page stuff. But what Parsons did in organizing the transport and getting everything down, that's not exciting, but it's very important.
Crucial.
Crucial.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Indeed.
And if all that hadn't arrived when Grant needed it, the Confederates might very well have been able to get out of their situation and go fight another day.
Indeed. Indeed. And that would have been Abraham Lincoln would have been one very disappointed president.
Yes, and he might have very well been a one-term president too.
Very, very, very well stated. Very well stated. Well, I think it's also, maybe this is a good time, and I'm sure you can help me with this. The brother, Colonel Charles Parsons, was, in fact, very instrumental once the college was conceived and started. He was really the man who spent the days and the weeks and the months in Fairfield on campus helping achieve the momentum that they needed to be a successful college. It was General Lewis Baldwin Parsons who returned to his home in Illinois, who had other business responsibilities. So it's, perhaps you'll agree with me that Charles played a very, very important role in the success of Parsons College in those early days.
Again, here is somebody that was largely in the background,
Yes.
helping to get things done and to raise some funds if need be and so forth. And he made his home south and east of here in Keokuk, so he was a lot closer to the campus.
Yes, that's true.
Than was his older brother, the general. And then we might add also that there was Miss Julia Parsons, who was responsible for the construction of Broadview House, which many years later, when I came here, became the student center for a number of years. Well, Miss Julia also continued this role of sort of family oversight, that she was concerned and interested and wanted to be of help and assistance to the administration, trustees, students at the college. And so she had a long role to play here as kind of the on-campus representative of the Parsons family. Although she was not exercising control or anything like that, but was simply here to be helpful.
Help me for just a minute. Julia was the wife of Lewis Baldwin Parsons?
No, she was a daughter.
Of Donna, that's correct.
And
That's right.
she never married. So she could just kind of devote her life. And I have heard, and I don't think we need to get into it, but I've heard many interesting anecdotes from some of the older citizens of Fairfield who either knew her or their parents had known Miss Julia, but evidently she was one of those Victorian ladies that was interested in doing good and proceeded to do so.
Excellent, excellent. Do you think that the early days of the college, I should say the early years of the college, uh, were years that they were struggling to stay alive as a college, or do you think that they became successful in a reasonable amount of time?
I think really through the early years and into the World War I era, Parsons College, probably like a great many of the frontier colleges out in the prairies and plains, had a difficult time. It was a struggle. Uh, However, I've often heard, and I'm sure you have too, the church that has a heavy mortgage is a working church, and I think that is probably the case here. I read back in the chapters about the early years that President Parsons was to write in his book, The 50 Years of Parsons College, that those were good years. They accomplished a great deal. They expanded from the Ewing Hall. They built the chapel was the first building, and then they built Ankeny Hall, and the wings of Ankeny Hall enclosed the chapel, so it in effect kind of disappeared from ready view. But Ankeny Hall then became the main classroom building, and then of course, as we know, the weather out in Iowa can be treacherous at times, and shortly before classes were to begin, in the, oh, I've forgotten just exactly what year now, it may come to me later, but Ankeny Hall had been in use a few years when shortly before classes were to begin one autumn, lightning struck it, and before they could get fire equipment out from town to the campus, the hall, which included the chapel, had pretty much burned to the ground. And fortunately, however, Ballard Hall had just been completed. Ballard was intended as a women's dormitory, but was very quickly converted into a classroom building with chemistry labs and so forth. And I think the classes were delayed about 3 weeks that fall before they got everything ready.
I see.
So that was of course a real setback, but it didn't stop them. They didn't give up. They went ahead, and in the coming years, Fairfield Hall was built and became an important classroom building. And then the Barheit family in Burlington gave the money to build a chapel in memory of their son. And Barheit was completed about 1910, and Parsons Hall was added to it, and the architecture was very much the same as though they were a unit. And Parsons Hall became the religion or Bible building, and then Foster Hall was added as the science building. And there is a little background. Mr. Foster was a trustee of the college and was a member of the Foster family in Ottumwa, which had married into the Morrell meatpacking family. And it so happens that Mr. Foster was crossing the Atlantic to England, and he ran into Andrew Carnegie. And voyages in those days lasted considerably longer than they do now. So Mr. Foster had time to really acquaint Mr. Carnegie with the virtues of Parsons College and its need for a library. And it was at this time that Mr. Carnegie was very busy giving away libraries. And so Fairfield became not an entirely unique community, but close in having two Carnegie libraries, one here on the campus and the other in town. Our town library was originally, or became a Carnegie library also. So a number of buildings were built during this period from the latter part of the 19th century through up until World War I. World War I was for Parsons College, as it was for many private colleges, a rather difficult period. There was a decrease in enrollment, but that all proved to be very temporary. And in many respects, the period of the 20s, the Roaring '20s, is also looked upon as something of a golden age of the college prior to the Depression, in that the enrollment reached by along about 1928, 29, reached something over 700, which was the largest enrollment that the college had ever experienced until very recent times. Then, of course, came the Depression, and I recall former dean of the college, Keith Goltry, saying that many of the students of his day as a student here, they didn't have any money to pay tuition, but they would bring half a hog or a quarter of a steer, that sort of thing. And so they brought what they could, and that kept the students fed in the dining hall and so forth. But of course, enrollment declined. Then the war years of World War II were also rather difficult. That Parsons College, unfortunately, although it had what had been and I'm told, was the largest gymnasium west of the Mississippi River, by World War I, that gymnasium was rather outdated, and the college did not really have any facilities that suited the Navy or the Army for their college programs. So the college did not benefit as some other private schools did.
I see.
By being able to have an
Sure.
ROTC unit or an ASTP unit. And so those were difficult years, but the college did survive them. And then things picked up after the war, and the college did acquire some Quonset huts, surplus from the military for use as dormitories, and use some as office space and that sort of thing. And like many institutions, like the University of Iowa, I recall, what were to be temporary buildings for 5 years or so remained for what seemed forever. Excuse me.
I've often wondered, well, not wondered, but I had read, and perhaps you could help me with this, that when Fairfield Hall was proposed, that they were having difficulty with the financing, and actually went out into the community of Fairfield, and Fairfield came up with X amount of dollars through its citizens, and Fairfield Hall was able to be built. Have you?
That is my understanding of it, and hence really the name on the building. And really, it says something about not only back in the days when the Parsons brothers were trying to get the college started for their, as per their father's will, but this later one, and ever since, that the city of Fairfield and Parsons College had a close relationship. That
Yes.
the town has often been very supportive.
Yes.
And has come up with financing and help when the college needed it. And I recall one of the first things I heard about when I came here in 1955 was gearing up for the annual Fairfield Fund, which was an important fundraising campaign for the college. And that campaign continued on for a number of years. And in some respects, I guess that Fairfield Fund campaign eventually metamorphosed years later into the Greater Jefferson County Foundation. And
Yes, indeed.
that's,
In my readings of the historical profile of Parsons College, I definitely agree with you. There was a common denominator of synergy between the college and Fairfield. And I was impressed with Fairfield Hall, and there are a couple of other instances of which escaping it right at this moment, where the citizenry of Fairfield came to the rescue of Parsons College for one reason or another. And so it became very obvious to me in my reading that this was a very special union. This was union, or Parsons College was revered in many ways by the city and the populace of Fairfield.
I think that's fair to say, yes. There has been this relationship, and in my time here, particularly during the late 50s and 60s, when the college was growing in enrollment, many people in Fairfield opened their homes or created apartments
Yes,
out of
yes.
unused space and
Yes.
so forth in order to house the students. And the students often coming here found that they had kind of a home away from home, some family in Fairfield, and some of these alums continue to stop and see their surrogate family whenever they're passing through town or whenever they can.
It's quite touching, isn't it?
It is, it really is, because you don't hear this in lots of college communities, that the town is on one side and the gown are on the other side, and the two rarely mix very much.
Indeed.
But here that has not been the case, at least within my time. I know, for example, that there were many faculty people that took active roles in the various churches, and not just the Presbyterian Church, but sang in choirs
Sure.
and that sort of thing. And so it's there has been a very special relationship, and I was interested. I think maybe you were talking about it earlier today, that one of the alums that was here for the reunion weekend is interested in possibly having the Parsons crest or seal there in the entryway to the auditorium in the Civic Center, and with something to the effect of the alumni of Parsons College thank the people of Fairfield for their hospitality, something of that sort, but as a thank you and an acknowledgement to the people of Fairfield for what they have contributed to the college, to the students, and so forth. Well, I thought that was an interesting thought on the part of an alum as to what at least one alum would like to do, and I suspect that many others would probably agree.
When he proposed what you've just described to Dave Neff and myself, he started to fill up and it was very obvious that he was very touched, and he started to cry. I can say from my own experience that, having arrived in 1964 and a little shell-shocked as to what it was like to live in a cornfield in the Midwest, it took me about a semester to get over that, and then I found the Dream Motel at 472-4161 and became the night clerk from 7 o'clock in the morning until 7 o'clock 7 o'clock at night to 7 o'clock in the morning. And I really had this wonderful opportunity to meet just about everyone in Fairfield. And I thought to myself, I need to go back to Schenectady, New York, where I live currently and at the time, and tell everyone how wonderful the people are in Iowa, and how specifically wonderful they are in Fairfield, Iowa, and that I received what I think was a dual education. I received an education of academia through Parsons College, and I received an education in the adult life learning process of meeting and having to interact with other people And it was a wonderful, wonderful dual experience.
Yeah, well, I think many students have had a similar experience that you're referring to, and I would say that many of the townspeople have learned that it's not so weird to call pop soda, and that students have learned that, well, okay, soda can be pop, and that sort of thing. We have our idiosyncrasies and our differences of that nature. But one of the things that has often amused me in the years that I was teaching at Parsons was that how many students like yourself, brand new to the area, would come in and first thing they were saying was, well, I just want to get my grades up so I'm good now. I want to get out of here. I don't want to be living in these cornfields and so forth. And 4 years later, they're coming around asking me to write a letter of recommendation because they're trying to get a job here in Iowa. They want to teach in the school system
Sure.
of an Iowa community and so forth. And I don't know really how many people are living here in Fairfield right now, but may have come from other places and fully expecting to move on, but somehow just stayed on. And but I think we've had quite a bit of that. And they've found most of the students, if they came from the East Coast, they would go back
Yes.
when they finished and graduated from here. But I think they always had a warmer regard for the community than they might otherwise. And many have opted to stay in the Middle West, where perhaps the living is not quite as hectic as it is on the East Coast. So it varies. Maybe we have done something to counteract the brain drain that the Des Moines Register constantly comments on. And
Yes,
complains about.
yes, indeed. Well, you've done I think a real handsome job of taking us up to pre-Roberts, pre-Dr. Millard G. Roberts. I had read, and I continue to believe, that there seems to be a discrepancy out there that Parsons College was very much in the red pre-1955, that it was necessary for a president like Roberts to come in and save the college. Can you help me a little bit with that?
Well, I think that's that probably is one of those things that's a real matter of opinion. I think there were those who felt that the college was on its last legs, and certainly Dr. Roberts would let you know that it was on the last legs as he came here. However, I think there's much to be said for his coming in, bringing in some ideas from educators that he was acquainted with in the East and who had been advocating some of the things which he was able to put into effect here. One of the things that worked for him, it seems to me, here was, in a sense, the college was not so ingrained with its own habits, ritual, and all, that it was impossible to change.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a recognition that, well, the world around us is changing, and maybe we need to be changing with it. And certainly, the enrollment of the college when I came was approximately 300, probably with a little bit more than that, but for round numbers. That is a very small student body. Now, it may seem ideal in one sense, but it is very small to be able to support a curriculum and a faculty that really makes for a really truly good college.
Mm-hmm.
You had good people on the faculty and able and all that, but there's a limit to what a faculty of 300 people can really do, how much they can offer.
How, in your opinion, or why, in your opinion, had it waned to a figure of 300 students?
Well, I think the Depression and the war years had greatly reduced the enrollment. The Depression years, there were many who simply couldn't afford to go to college, and certainly there were colleges throughout the country that closed their doors during those years. And then the war years also, uh, there weren't the deferments for going to college that there were, for example, in the Vietnam era.
I see.
That the need for manpower was so great that very difficult to get a deferment just because you were going to college. You had to be going to college for something that was a national benefit.
Right.
And or you were a 4F and simply, the result was that an awful lot of our colleges around the country that had been coeducational turned into virtually women's seminaries during the war years. And I can remember, I've talked with some of the co-eds at the school where I went to college, oh, how wonderful it was when the men suddenly started returning. And and they did the same thing here, that they were awful glad to see the men coming back, but they didn't come back in droves. And as I mentioned, Parsons didn't have the facilities that attracted ROTC or ASTP units, and consequently, you don't have men that were trained in those units coming back to Parsons College to finish their degree. Whereas in many schools, that's what they did. They would come back and finish their degree where they had done their ROTC.
How many years do you suspect that that kind of enrollment, 300 students, had gone on? How far back?
Well, I think it probably goes back into the war years, probably back into the Depression years. I've never really tried to check enrollment, but my guess is that it probably, in the Depression years, went from 700 and some down to 300. At some point, I read that it got actually below 300, and that's why I picked 300 as a kind of a round number. But it's you're just not getting, from that number of students, you're not getting enough unless you were just charging extraordinarily high tuition, and the college never did do that. You're just not getting enough tuition, and there was no endowment to speak of.
Right.
And so what Roberts, it seems to me, saw, and the trustees agreed with him, was that one of the things you had to do was to beef up the enrollment. And Roberts said, some years later, that the one thing that was really, in his opinion, going for him when he came to here was the admissions program. The admissions department was energetic and was trained. They were really going out and looking for students. And consequently, he felt good about it, and students who could pay. And this was one of the things which Dr. Roberts did emphasize and put a great store by, was recruiting students who could pay the full tuition, in addition to also admitting students who were qualified as college students but didn't have the wherewithal to pay the full bill. And so while the publicity had Parsons filled with nothing but rich kids, that is really only part of the truth.
Exactly.
There were rich students, but there were also students who needed a lot of financial help.
Indeed.
And a lot of the financial help came from the tuition paid by the students whose family could afford to pay the full tuition.
I wonder if you could share with our viewers what you feel was Miller G. Roberts' most significant contribution under the heading of the what was called the Parsons College Plan. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I've always thought that his willingness to admit students whose academic record, either in high school or in the first year or two of college, was less than stellar, was a very good one because he also developed a program for those students. He didn't just readmit them and then sink or swim. We had, and you probably remember it from thinking back to your own student days here, we had in the core program, the freshman, sophomore courses, we had a 3-layer program where you had the professor in charge of the course giving the lectures 3 times a week for the 50 minutes. And then we had the preceptors, and these were people who were trained teachers. They all had their master's degrees. Most of them had experience of teaching in high school or in a private prep school. And their job was to run small sections of 15, 20 students each, discussion groups, and they would meet a couple, 3 times a week to discuss the readings, the material that had been presented in the lectures, and that sort of thing. And then what I think was very significant, and I'm not aware of other schools doing it to the extent we did, but that was to employ a cadre of full-time tutors. And they converted the basement of the library, which had just been storage area, they converted that into the tutorial center and set up cubicles as rather running way ahead of offices with their cubicles today. And that was a busy place, particularly from late afternoon until around 10 o'clock, 10:30 at night, because that's when the tutors met with students who were having difficulties. And many of the tutors were graduates, recent graduates of Parsons College, who were hired. They wanted to go on to graduate school, but they needed to work for a year or two to build up their own bank account before they could go to graduate school. And so they came on board and worked. And that was their job. They weren't going to school. They weren't having to worry about their own academic program. They were there to help these students. And I think, from my observation and from talking with other faculty members from other departments, I felt also that these tutors really did an excellent job, because oftentimes these young men, women, could often make contact, get through to a student what the student needed to do to succeed in a way that we, the faculty, could not get through.
Well, I am here to tell you that that very often was the case. And I can tell everyone that it was one of my real opportunities was to get in front of a tutor who taught me how to take notes.
Yes.
Because I didn't have any skills as to how to disseminate the information that was necessary for an exam. And once that was accomplished, I did everything I possibly could to interact with those tutors, because they often had information that was not given in lecture and in discussion as to how and what you might study to enhance your opportunity to pass an exam. And so many times I was saved by that. But yes, I have to tell you that I think that was Robert's most significant contribution, was the fact that he had set up there was, if you absolutely made up your mind coming to Parsons that you weren't going to do anything, I suppose like any college you go to, you had that option.
Mm-hmm. Sure
but
did.
in this particular situation, you did have a second opportunity. I had come out of the University of New Mexico. I frankly didn't know how to study, and here was a college that was going to teach me how to study and give me all the opportunities that, heretofore was not in place. And I was so amazed that this Parsons College program, if you will, plan was there for my benefit. And it wasn't, and certainly for everyone's benefit. And it made a big, big difference in my success at Parsons.
Well, I'm certainly glad to hear that.
I thought you
from,
might.
one of the users of the program. But that certainly was definitely the case. Many colleges have a learning center, various names, and they will employ some students on a very part-time basis.
Sure.
And some of these students will work very hard and may be very good at it, but they've got their own courses to worry about and their own exams to take. And that, I think, was one of the good things about our program, was that these people were employed to do just this, and not as something
Sure.
in addition to
Sure,
what they
sure.
were regularly doing.
Exactly.
Now, obviously, this was a fairly expensive program because I've forgotten now how many tutors we had, but it seems to me we were paying them. Now, remember, we were in the 1960s. I think we were paying them right around $8,000 a year, which was a pretty good salary in those days. Might not seem so great today. But then you had the preceptors, who were all with master's degrees, teaching experience. They also had to be paid, and they had given up teaching jobs elsewhere to come here, so they had to be paid.
Well,
So it was
yes.
it was expensive, but I think it was really worthwhile.
Oh my gosh, yes.
And the thing that it demonstrated, and all, I think it's all well summed up by one of our alums not too long ago. I think I read this in the newspaper that this alum was quoted as saying, Parsons College was an easy college to get into, but it was an awful hard one to get out of. At the program, the curriculum, what was offered was not watered down. It was simply that we added it in the core courses. Now, in your advanced courses, we didn't have all that. By the time you got to advanced courses, presumably you'd gotten to know how to study
Precisely.
and all
Precisely.
that when you got there. But it gave them an opportunity to learn how to do it and have that second chance. Then there's the other thing about the second chance. Robert's talked a lot about that. And how many colleges and universities in the country today are very good about giving second chances. It's the kind of routine for many of them. But in many respects, a student came out of, let us say, XYZ high school. May not have been valedictorian, but certainly had a lot of good grades. Never had any trouble getting through school. Played basketball, and so on and so forth. And then they hit the University of Iowa. And big classes, kind of impersonal,
Right.
and all of that, and suddenly they come lost. Now, many kids go to Iowa and they do splendidly. They just right in there and find it, but others don't. And they flounder. Well, a lot of times our colleges, our big universities especially, were overcrowded in the 60s. And one way of reducing pressure on upper classes was to get rid of a number of students so that you wouldn't have them crowding in the upper classes. So they flunked out. Well, and perhaps they shouldn't have really been flunked out, but they lost out. Well, we took in many of those people, and often it turned out they really were very good students. But they hadn't found themselves right away. They found
Exactly.
themselves here
Exactly.
and went on and been very successful. One of my favorite stories on this sort of thing is a senior that I had. We were going over his record early in the last semester to make sure that we had everything covered. And he had flunked out of Williams College, which is probably the most preeminent liberal arts college in the country,
So I've heard.
and so they like us to know. But at any rate, he flunked out, and I thought to myself, for Williams to have accepted him in the first place, he had to have had
Exactly.
an awfully good
Exactly.
record in secondary school. And I asked him about that. Oh, yes, he did no problem in secondary school, did fine. And I said, well, what happened to Williams? Well, he said, nobody really told me I had to study. I read the textbook and I went to my classes most of the time. But he said there was a lot of partying and I enjoyed that. And it was an awful shock when at the end of the year they told me you don't come back. And it so happened that this tells you how long ago it was because he was on the train. He was on the train down from Massachusetts to New York to catch a train back to the Middle West when he happened to see in a newspaper an ad for our admissions office in Manhattan. So he stopped in to see them between trains, and he said he felt much relieved on the train back home because now he could tell the folks he had a college that would probably accept him and he could continue on. Well, he was straight A here, and Harvard Law, Yale Law, and Michigan Law, all three schools accepted him without question.
Oh, what a wonderful story. What a wonderful story. I just want to add that there's just a little bit of a twist of irony here, inasmuch as Lewis Baldwin Parsons Sr. raised his family of General Lewis Baldwin Parsons and Colonel Charles Parsons, and if you will, in Williamstown, Massachusetts. And when the senior watched Williams College be built, it was in his mind that if he ever made enough money and he could contribute to the conception of a college, that's exactly what he would do.
Yes, I think that is a very interesting coincidence, perhaps.
Yeah, indeed.
Whatever
Indeed.
it is.
Well, certainly to that story it is, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly yes for that story. And of course, the fact that the Parsons family came out of this New England, New York, East Coast area where education in that era was important. Most of the colleges that were organized in the 17th, 18th century, the goal was the theological seminary from the college. That was the goal. Now, by the time we get into the 19th century, that is important, but it isn't as important as it had been in the earlier years.
Well, we've spoken as to the some of the assets of having Miller G. Roberts come in as president of Parsons College, and there are others for sure. What do you think, in your opinion? I have heard and read that Dr. Roberts was a subscriber to deficit spending, and that might very well have been a contribution to the demise of the college. Could you speak to that?
Well, I think it probably was a contribution, an important contribution to the demise of the college, that he overspent, and there does seem to be, as you say, he was a devoted or a devotee of deficit spending. And certainly he comes out of an era when he had an awfully good example of deficit spending in what the U.S. government had been doing for years. And he did not seem to be particularly concerned about indebtedness and the fact that perhaps the debt was getting to be more and more unmanageable, which he kept insisting everything was manageable, but there were others who apparently disagreed and felt that it had gotten to be unmanageable. Of course, I do think one of the ironies is that when the college lost its accreditation, and the word that does filter back is that the powers in the North Central thought that the financial situation had gotten out of hand. Well, certainly the loss of accreditation did not help the financial situation at all. Obviously, it worsened it and really made it very difficult to manage. But we find, of course, that people in all walks of life sometimes make bad decisions, and that turn out to be very unfortunate rather than being the sound business. I hesitate to use the word business-like, but sometimes not always the most business-like decision after all.
Exactly. So here we have 100+ years of the history of a small college that in many ways shaped the education, if you will, of multiples of hundreds, if not thousands, of students. And when Roberts came up on the scene, he was able to move from a 300 enrollment up to as much as 5,000 students. And in that process came a number of nuances as to what could have or might have happened to save Parsons College. Is there one particular possibility that might have saved Parsons College that's always you've given thought to?
Well, it always seemed to me that Dr. Roberts could be, in many instances, utterly charming. I remember within the first weeks that I was here, the the alumni secretary told me that they were organizing an alumni chapter in, of all places, Mount Pleasant, home of our great rival, Iowa Wesleyan College. And that Dr. Roberts was to speak to the opening meeting at the Iris Iris restaurant. And would I drive him over? And because he was feeling rather tired and so he'd been on the road a lot. So, oh, fine, I'm happy to. Well, to make a long story short, as they always say, he slept all the way over until almost the restaurant. For them, he hardly got in the car before he was sound asleep, and he had that technique, which I understand Thomas Alva Edison also had. He could just drop off to sleep instantly. Well, he could do that. Slept all the way over there. Woke up within a quarter of a mile of the restaurant. And got out of the car just as chipper as could be. And we walked in. He greeted everybody. He gave a terrific speech. What intended to do, what the goals were for the college, and so forth. And then coming back, I didn't have to say a word. He just told me a lot more about what he had in mind for the college. I thought afterwards, I wish I'd been able to take notes because an awful lot of it came true. But he could do that. But evidently, when he got with his fellow presidents, people he really needed to cultivate, evidently he could turn on the other side and be kind of arrogant and don't need you.
So I've heard.
And all of that sort of thing. And I think in this life, if we're going to accomplish things, we need other people to be of assistance.
Indeed.
We don't need them to be opposing us. And it seemed to me that he just more and more created a hostile situation where more and more college presidents and other administrators and so forth were eager to try and do him in. Well, about the only way apparently they could get at him was to get at the college.
Sure.
And it seems to me he could have gotten and done what he did and wanted to do, but could have done it with greater finesse and without making others look bad.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, it really came back to haunt him, didn't it?
It really did.
President of University of Wisconsin is the president of the North Central Accreditation Bureau, and that is not a good person to have on the wrong side of you.
No, it certainly is not.
So
you want support from that.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. So just like many other situations that we've seen in our lives, there are people who are very intelligent and have lots of good ideas and are reasonably good at implementing them or very good at implementing them, but there seems to be a little lack of common sense on certain issues. And I think that is an example of what came back to haunt him.
And I
Lack
think
of common sense, getting along with other people.
I think he had that blind side.
Yes,
that,
it would appear.
That he just didn't see that you need
Exactly.
Other people to be of assistance, or at least you need them to be helpful enough that they stay out of your way. But when you start antagonizing and making life difficult for them, and publicly, in one way or another, making some of these people look like fools, whatnot, they don't take that kindly, and so I think it came back to haunt him, and of course came back to well, pretty much wreck the college.
Yes, that's what I
and of course
believe.
How many lives of students were affected adversely, I have no way of knowing. I do know this, that when the college finally closed, now do remember that the college regained its accreditation in 1970. This was after Dr. Roberts, of course, was gone. And when the college closed, it closed as a fully accredited college. And I have found that some people, even here in town, are surprised when I tell them that they kind of forgotten there was a period there where we still were marching right along.
Well, it's interesting. When you reminded me about a month ago, I really had to stop and think for a minute. And yeah, you're absolutely correct. The likelihood is that once the accreditation was lost, that there was a stigma that went out, and it was that stigma that would have made it very difficult for Parsons College to recoup.
It did. And furthermore, as you lost some enrollment because of that, and you have to cut expenses, well, where is one of the places where we had to cut? We didn't cut entirely, of course, but we did have to cut back on the number of admissions people we had. So we don't have, in those final years, we don't have as many men and women out in the field telling the story of Parsons College and correcting misconceptions as we had before the loss of accreditation. The other thing is that the press is much more interested in the sensational. That's what sells newspapers. And consequently, when a college loses accreditation, that's news.
Right.
When a college regains accreditation, that may be news, but it's back on the third page.
Sure. Well, I just wondered now, since we've had I've learned quite a bit right in this very conversation, if we might shift gears here just a little bit and make mention of what is going to be a new civic center in Fairfield, Iowa, now named for purposes of working Jefferson County Civic Center. Can you just spend just a few minutes, and describe what you believe this civic center is going to provide the city of Fairfield and its inhabitants?
Well, I hope and expect that the Civic Center is going to provide, among other things, an additional venue or theater for the use of the various arts organizations that exist in this town and which did not exist here 30 years ago. We still have one main auditorium that is serving a lot more groups than it did 30 years ago. That, of course, is the high school auditorium. And in many respects, a good facility for a great many purposes. But we now have several dance groups. We have 3 or 4 theater groups. We have the considerably expanded high school program itself. We have an expanded program for the Concert Association. Plus we have other music organizations in town. And we're all competing to use the high school auditorium. And there's just so much, many days in the year that it can be used. And I'm reminded of 2 things in this regard that show how crowded things are. 2 years ago, I think it was, maybe 3 now, we had a very fine production of the Nutcracker, done locally. It was all local talent. And it was really a splendid production. They wanted the high school auditorium for 3 nights. And I got to talking with the lady that had been the producer of the program, the show, and she said we needed that 3rd night to really to make money, to actually have a little
Sure.
more in the pot
Sure.
than went in. But we couldn't get it for the 3rd night, so they had to make do with 2 performances, sold out, I think, in both performances, and could have, she said, sold out the 3rd one if they could have gotten the auditorium, but it was booked. More recently, you weren't here for it, but a group got together and decided that in a way we ought to have kind of a salute to Broadway kind of talent show to stimulate interest in the fundraising, another continued fundraising campaign for the Civic Center. And this was to be quite a variety of show using modern, contemporary Broadway show tunes and so forth. I remember when I went to the first rehearsal for what I was involved with, the director of the show told us that the reason that we were having it on this particular weekend in December, it was the only weekend he could get.
Oh, dear.
That there was no
Sure.
other Friday, Saturday
Sure.
that he could get.
So you see really just a wonderful, wonderful opportunity.
I sure do. And then you see, the thing of it is, when our local groups can't keep that auditorium busy, or that theater busy, there is no lack of artists, performers, so forth, that are out there wanting to be on your theater bill. So I would say that we would have no trouble in having something on the stage every day of the year if that's what the Civic Center Board wanted to do. But I think there's no question there could be a lot of activity there. And then, now that happens to be the side of the Civic Center that is of greater interest to me personally.
Sure.
But on the other side, there's the exhibition area. And from what I've understood from various board members, talking with the people at the Civic Center down in Quincy, this is an area that you find will be very busy. Well, now, we had an automobile show here just recently, and if memory serves me correctly, I think the cars got kind of wet. I don't know what the promoters of that show think, Bob, but I wouldn't be surprised what maybe they would have been happy to have booked the exhibition hall and had the cars inside so that rain or shine, they wouldn't have to worry. Now, we've got, I think, coming up this coming weekend, if my memory serves me correctly, we've got the Power Wagon Show,
Yes.
which I see is billed as the largest of its kind in the world. I don't know what their thinking is, but I could see where maybe they would like to put those power wagons
Sure.
in
Well,
there, and so on.
being an antique car owner myself, I can tell you that what you're suggesting is right on the mark.
Yeah.
You'd much rather be protected than to be out in foul weather.
And so I think that is the sort of thing that would be there. But now, how does this benefit the community? Well, for one thing, I think everybody in the community is not going to go to everything that's in that center. I think we can just stipulate that's a given. But over the course of a year, there will probably be one or more things that ultimately just about everybody in town could go to enjoy, see,
Exactly.
and do. In the process, I think you bring more people into the community. This will be beneficial to the number of restaurants we have in town, because the more people they feed. Well, I just think of the restaurant we had lunch today. Now, there were 5 of us having lunch there, that if it hadn't been for the Jefferson or the Parsons College Foundation, we wouldn't have been having lunch there.
Well, that's
And that's
exactly
5
right.
lunches that they wouldn't have served. So, I think with the Civic Center
Good point.
bringing people into the town, we have motels here in town that can benefit from it. And then in our art galleries. Now, I think our Parsons College alums, most of them probably had a good time Friday night, just seeing the first Friday art walk for themselves.
Indeed.
Many of them probably had never heard of it
No, as a matter
until
of
they
fact,
came to
that's
town.
very much the case.
So I feel that something like this can be something that brings the community together ultimately, as our high school auditorium, our high school football field tends to bring an awful lot of the people
Sure,
together.
sure.
And it becomes a real center of community activity. And
What is the goal of the Civic Center financially? How much has been raised and how much is needed to
well, on that, you really are asking me questions I don't know.
oh, I see, all right.
Because I'm not on the Civic Center board. I'm happy to say that this project is a project of the younger generation in Fairfield, not the oldsters like myself.
Sure.
I would say this, I think that the Civic Center board, I think most of the membership on that board are probably in their 40s and early 50s. There is one that I can think of is in the 60s. But I do think that that a lot of the older citizens like myself, we have been supporting and supportive
Sure.
of the Civic Center
Sure.
project. But I'm happy to say that it is a younger group, and it is a good cross-section of the community.
Well, it's my understanding that out of $6 million that are needed to build the Civic Center, that there is another $500,000 to $600,000 to go. And having said that, I would like to just discuss for a minute, if I may, the conception of the Parsons College Foundation, which was conceived in tandem with David Neff, as you know, is Vice President of Iowa State Bank and Trust Company, and a graduate, 1969 graduate of Parsons College. And we both saw in unison the need for a means of vehicle to support the city of Fairfield. using the alum of Parsons College as a conduit, as a source for monies to come into the city for the benefit of the Civic Center. And having done so, we are now fortunate to be $200,000 into a $300,000 to $500,000 goal. There is the opportunity for naming rights to the auditorium, the lobby to the auditorium, very possibly to be named Parsons College Alumni Hall. And in that hall will be two rather large displays that will display artifact and memorabilia that will rotate in and out of the library, and will take the chronology of Parsons College and display different facets at different times to give the community and the alum the opportunity to see Parsons College once again. On top of that, there's a gift of a stained glass window from Bar High Chapel that will be positioned artistically in the hall. We have not had the opportunity to talk to the board completely, but we think as a foundation that it might be very helpful to have a station where someone can, a citizen or an alumni of the college can sit down and punch in questions in a computer and get back responses as to the history of the college, specific individuals that have graduated from the college, specific professors that we particularly cared for at Parsons College. And that coupled with very possibly a bust or a statue of General Lewis Baldwin Parsons, who obviously was the conceiver of Parsons College. And having accomplished those goals, those financial goals, we hope to go beyond that and very possibly earn the right for the naming rights of the Civic Center itself to be called something like Parsons College Memorial Civic Center, as an example. And what a wonderful, wonderful opportunity for a college that unfortunately met its demise in 1973, has not had any bricks and mortar, has had its campus, if you'll forgive me for saying this, destroyed. And this will be the first opportunity for bricks and mortar, an opportunity for alumnus to return, an opportunity for citizens of the Jefferson County, if you will, to enjoy what they remember of Parsons College, and, as I found out even maybe more importantly, all those young people that have never heard of Parsons College that live right here in Fairfield, Iowa, and Jefferson County. So we are so tickled and we are so pleasantly surprised to see that we are starting to get responses from alumnus that want to participate financially, and there's going to be a campaign that's going to be initiated in the next 30 days. We are very much hoping and expect to be financially successful in being able to satisfy and meet the naming rights, at the very least, of the entrance hall to the theater, or possibly the naming rights to the Civic Center. Did I leave anything out that you know that I, in terms of?
Well, one of the other things that I think it is hoped will be installed in the Civic Center, and perhaps some of the money for it could come from the foundation, and that would be the Bar High Chapel organ.
Oh, yes.
The great pipe organ that was installed there in, 1962 in Bar High. And it's a very fine organ. It's not your typical church organ. It certainly could be used, as it was in Bar High, for church purposes, but...
Excuse me for interrupting, but was that not a gift from Clyde W. Wright, who was one of the trustees of the...
I really don't know on that. There is a little plaque on the organ, something that dedicated to the wife, the deceased wife of a very brief faculty administrator here, who went out to one of the satellite colleges. It was one of those things that I thought I think I'd only met the woman once before she died, and she may have been, and probably was, a very fine lady and all, but no real connection to the college. So supposedly the funds were raised from everybody, but it could very well have been Clyde Wright.
I see.
I really just don't know on that. But it is, as pipe organs go in this world, it's a very new pipe organ. You figure in Europe, some of these are 300 and 500 and 600 years old.
Sure.
And as I understand it, the architects have, in their design of the theater, have allowed for the placement of the console so that it can be out in view when needed, when being used, and it can be tucked away, out of the way, when it's not being used, and that there would be space for the organ pipes. But as I understand it, the board, and rightly so, I can understand, they're not including that in the cost of the building. They want to get the building built.
Sure.
And then,
Well,
but at least with planning this way, you can sort of allow space.
Indeed.
And if it doesn't materialize,
Well, that's right.
that's another matter.
Well,
But I think that's one of the things I would like to see, and I hope would be added.
excellent. Well, the foundation would be 100% behind that, and I want to emphasize the fact that the monies that are being raised to get the Civic Center built, if you will, are to be satisfied with the campaign that we currently have, but that the foundation will continue to solicit the graduates of Parsons College for additional monies to, as an example, install the organ and to provide other services, through the Civic Center that would be helpful. One of the things we would like very much to accomplish is once this particular campaign has come to a successful conclusion, is to give some monies to the museum so that they might curate, am I saying that correctly? Curate the contents
Yes.
of Parsons College and maybe get some help in there. There are literally hundreds of boxes that have not been opened.
It's what I've understood,
Yes.
that there's a great deal there, and of course, that's just all volunteer help, and probably a curator, if not a full-time curator, at least somebody with that kind of training for a part-time could be very helpful.
Sure.
And yes, I'm sure that they need some support
Exactly.
to
Well,
get all that done. And the Civic Center itself is going to need endowment assistance.
Sure.
It's going to need that kind of
Exactly.
help to make sure that it's on a solid foundation and stays on a solid foundation.
Well, Bob, if I don't say so myself, I think we've done a rather handsome job of what we were assigned to do here.
Well, I think we've talked on and on and on.
It would seem. Well, once again, this just helps me confirm that you continue to be my very favorite professor.
Well,
And
thank you,
thank you.
John. Thank you very much.